Today, I'm going to talk about a new watch from Polar, the Polar Grit X. 8.87 miles, 8 minutes, 44 seconds per mile, 136 beats per minute today, taking it super nice and easy for my first run today with the Polar Grit X. This is a new watch that I'm super excited about, even though it's probably not exactly directed at me. It's directed more towards the outdoor enthusiast, the trail runner, the hill climber, the mountain goat, but it's got so many features that I'm so excited for, features that I've been waiting for Polar to put into a watch. Can't wait to talk to you guys about them. But first, I do want to go over some disclosures. This is a watch that was sent to me by Polar for the purpose of review, so I didn't have to pay for it, but they're not paying me to make the video or to use the watch, and they're not going to get a chance to preview any of my footage or my thoughts until you guys get a chance to see this video on YouTube. So with the disclosures out of the way, let's talk about some of the exciting things in the Polar Grit X. What we have is a ruggedized running watch from Polar that meets military standards, Mil Standard 8106, which means it can take a beating, which is going to be useful if you're going to be using it for things like trail runnings, your outdoor adventures, your multi-day adventures, because it's got an epic battery life, up to 40 hours of GPS recording time, up to 100 hours of GPS activity tracking time, depending on if you stretch out some, basically I think some of the GPS tracking or how much it's pinging. One of the things that it does in regards to that battery life is it tells you whenever you start a new activity or whenever your activity is paused, how much battery life is left or how many hours of activity it can continue tracking. So not just a percentage reminder of how much battery life is left totally, but in terms of actual active tracking time, it tells you an estimate of that. And so that I think is pretty useful and pretty amazing to be able to have for the watch. But in addition to that, what you have is a pretty chunky watch that's a little bit beefy, but I kind of appreciate that in a running watch. I like slim watches as well, but for the GPS to work well, to get a really big battery in there, you're gonna have to have something that's a little bit bigger. And this watch is a little bit bigger, but I don't mind that. And it actually turns out to be a little bit light. I mean, it feels lighter on wrist. I haven't done an actual weight or compared the weights, but it feels lighter on wrist than the Vantage V, which I've already gotten quite accustomed to wearing, although it is probably the heaviest watch that I've ever run with. But along with that beefiness on the Grit X, you do get nice pushable tactile buttons, round buttons on the Grit X compared to the kind of the thinner, longer buttons that are on the Vantage V, but the placement is the same and the way that you interface with them is the same. So if you're familiar with the Polar setup, this is going to be really easy for you to jump right in and be very familiar with how they work. In terms of the pushiness or the clackiness of the buttons, they're a little bit softer of a push than the Vantage V's buttons are, but I find that to be a little bit better. They're a little bit easier to press, especially when I have had mittens on or gloves on for the past couple of days as I've been running with this watch. So in addition to the footage that you saw from, which was from yesterday's run, I also took them for my run with me this morning. So I've got 2 runs in my belt on them, not a lot, but this is really just an introduction video to this watch because there's just so many features and I only got the watch a couple of days ago. So definitely don't have enough time to go through all the features now, but I do want to go over some of the additional features that I think are going to be super awesome. So some of the main things are that it's a GPS watch that has a compass built into it now as well, and an altimeter. And so some of the watch faces that you can have, or some of the data fields that you can have as you're running, is you can have one that tracks your altitude, and you can also have one that tracks just your direction, which is something that's super useful for someone like me who can get lost pretty much anywhere. So that's something that's super useful to have for a lot of my adventures. Now, I don't really get too lost in the city. This is where I live. I know where I'm going, and the city is pretty much a grid, so not too big of an issue. But anytime I do get out into a trail, I pretty much get lost every single time. So at least being able to know where I'm facing could be really helpful. Some of the other features about this watch that I think are going to build on top of that are some of the integrations that it has. One of the integrations in the new screens that you have are the Hill Splitter. And so it takes the data from the altimeter, and also it tracks when you are running up a hill. So that way you can then be able to look at your data later. One of the strengths that I've felt like from the Polar ecosystem is, in addition to just like the ability for the watch to do its tracking thing, is the ability to take that data and like do something useful with it afterwards. I'm a big fan of the Polar Flow interface and the way that it presents data. I'm looking forward to getting to some hills. Chicago isn't exactly known for its hilliness, but once kind of the world gets back to normal, I'm looking forward to getting onto some hills, getting to some areas even in Chicago that have hills, to really put that feature to the test to help me understand where my strengths and weaknesses are when it comes to hill climbing. So that way I can not only train better for it, but I also can understand on a new terrain or a new course, taking the elevation map that might exist on another route and being able to understand, all right, here's how I have to adjust if I want to maintain a certain kind of race pace. So just another way of being able to understand relative effort versus just like kind of just the plain pace and time information that we might otherwise train with. The other integration that I think is going to be really useful for someone like me is the integration with Komoot. And Komoot, K-O-M-O-O-T, is like a route planning and route tracking app. And what it's going to be able to do, I haven't been able to do any thorough testing with it yet. I just got the watch, but something that I'll definitely have a follow-up video on is you'll be able to map out routes, whether you're on a bike or when you're trail running or just regular running. And then that will integrate with the watch. So that way you can get turn-by-turn directions. Again, something that's going to be super useful for someone like me who gets lost pretty much anywhere. So that way I can have a little buzz or a notification on my watch telling me when I have to turn. The other thing that I've been looking at already, which I'm really excited about, is the Fuelwise, which is a new feature that they're introducing for the Grit X. And what that is there's 2 ways to use it. One is a manual way to tell you or remind yourself to fuel when you're in the middle of an activity. And one is kind of a smart way of it telling you when it thinks you should be refueling. And so you can set it so that way like every 30 minutes it gives you a reminder to take another gel, that kind of thing. Or you can tell it, here's about how long I'm going to be going out for today. Maybe it's a 2-hour adventure or a 3-hour adventure or a workout. And I'm going to be doing, zone 2, relatively easy work like I was doing today. How often should I be taking gels? It'll tell you, for that amount of time, you should be taking a gel every so often, assuming you're taking in 20 grams of carbs each time. And it'll also then tweak it so that way if you do end up working harder, it might accelerate that timing for you just a little bit to accommodate when you're actually going to need that gel or that next round of nutrition. So that's a pretty interesting feature as well. Again, something that I haven't had a huge amount of time to test. Right now, I'm doing pretty much all easy runs, but I'll have to do some testing with some tempo runs and see how that really can help or aid with what I think I have a pretty good sense of what my nutritional needs are. But it'll be interesting to see like how I feel comparing to what my gut would be to what the watch is telling me to do on some of those harder efforts. So something that I'll definitely follow up for as I get to test this watch a little bit further. So hit the subscribe button if you're not already subscribed so you can see when that next video hits. Let's talk about some of the data that I was able to collect, at least so far. Again, I only went on the one run, actually 2 runs at this point, but for the purpose of this video, 1 main run that I've been on so far. And what I did was I put on both watches. And now how I normally have my Vantage V set up is that I have the Vantage V and I pair that to the Polar OH1, which is a armband optical heart rate sensor. So that's something that I like to use. And I pair it also with a Stride foot pod, so I get power, pace, and distance data from the foot pod as well. And that's what I did for the run at the same time using the Grit X, using it by itself with no sensor. So the heart rate data is going to come from the Grit X. Power data is going to come from the Grit X as well, which the Vantage V can also give you power from the wrist. The Grit X can do that as well. And the pace and distance data is going to be coming from the GPS. So let's take a look at that. I run it through DC Rainmaker's analyzer tool, and the first thing I'll take a look at is the power. And the power looks pretty much what I would expect, what I've done comparing Stride power versus wrist-based power, which the peaks and valleys all seem to be about the same. They all seem to be recording about the same kind of data at about the same time, but the graphs are always just kind of transposed by a little bit because I think whatever coefficients or numbers they're using to calculate that power are off by like a set amount. But the data looks pretty good, about pretty much what I would expect. The next thing we'll take a look at is heart rate. And again here, the heart rate's doing surprisingly good, much better than I would expect from a wrist. I'm kind of the opinion that I don't trust any heart rate sensors for running that comes from the wrist. It just doesn't work for me. I don't know if it's my skin tone, my anatomy, or where I'm placing it or what. But for today, I tried to move the watch down a little bit further than I normally feel comfortable wearing it so I can try and get that wrist-based heart rate. Trying to put it 2 fingers from like this bone down here, so a little bit lower than I have it here. And I ran with it that way, comparing it to the optical sensor from the forearm, then the Polar OH1. And for the first, it looks like about 45 minutes. I'm getting really similar results from both, which is pretty amazing. Very impressed with that. But at that point, what typically happens with me and most of my runs with just a wrist-based optical sensor is after about like 45 minutes, it just starts going haywire. I don't know why. There's nothing I can do to reposition it, move it, to try and get it to give me like normal readings again. And so what you're seeing there is a difference between those two. So about what I would expect in terms of what's happening in the later part of the run. But in the beginning part of the run, I'm really impressed with how well that the optical sensor at the wrist does for the Grit X. Here's the thing that confused me a little bit. Both the Vantage V and the Grit X have altimeters in them, and so they're taking actual measurements of the barometric pressure. I believe that's how they do it, and they're getting altitude that way. I was expecting there to be some variation between the two watches, but here it looks like I'm pretty much off by 200 feet when I'm looking at the different tracings between one watch to the other, with the Grit X giving me the higher altitude than the Vantage V does. So I'm not really sure why that is, but for this run, it looks like the altitude was somewhere, or not 200 feet, but 200 meters. So I'm anywhere between 200 meters or 180 meters. Not exactly doing any sky running here in Chicago. So I'm not sure how significant those differences are or why that would be. I'll have to take a deeper look into that to see if that's something that persists or if that was just kind of a fluke that happened for today. And here's the tracings that I got from the 2 different watches, doing a couple of little loops in my neighborhood. And because I'm just trying to not commute for exercise, trying to stay off the lakefront path, which is where I would normally run because that's closed by the mayor. And it looks like the tracings I got are pretty similar, which is about what I would expect. So pretty good results there. I'll be doing some subsequent runs pairing the Grit X with some of the sensors that I normally like to run in as well. And so we'll be able to see how that fares in comparison as well. So it still can compare with the foot pod and all my external heart rate monitors that I need it to. So no issues with that there. The other thing that I still love about the Grit X that are carried over from the Vantage V and the Vantage line are the sleep tracking. That's something that I watch and follow very closely every day. The Vantage V has great battery life. The Grit X has even better battery life. And the important part about that is it enables me to not have to charge it overnight. And so I can actually wear it so it can track my sleep, and it can tell me not only how long am I sleeping, it's one thing for me to say like I went to bed at a certain hour and I woke up at a certain hour, therefore I got so many hours of sleep, but it can actually tell how long I've been sleeping, but it also can tell how good or how much quality I'm getting out of that sleep. And I can kind of tweak my training accordingly. Or if not tweak my training so much, I can kind of be a little bit gentler to myself. If I'm having a hard time during a workout, then it's, I didn't really get great sleep the night before. So, I don't have to be so hard on myself and think that the sky is falling because I had a bad workout on that particular day. So that's a feature that's still here, and I'm enjoying that. The other thing that I noticed after a run is that it gives me, and I think it's part of like the Fuelwise system, is that it's giving me a breakdown in terms of the activity that I just did, in terms of how much of the activity did I burn, not only how many calories did I burn, which I don't really pay too much close attention to, but it gives me a breakdown. I think it's based on some of my weight data and also my heart rate information that it's getting in terms of how much of the activity was burning carbohydrates versus fats versus proteins in terms of energy sources. So that can also help me in terms of refueling, in terms of what else do I need to put back into my body to be able to recover well for the next day. So that's something else that I will be taking a closer look at, because I think it's pretty fascinating in terms of that kind of data and analytics. So pretty exciting ways to look at data in the Grit X, pretty exciting way to calculate those things that I'm very excited to test out in further detail. I'm very excited about the Komoot integration, and I'm very interested to see how the Hill Splitter is going to work. I played around with it just a little bit, and all it really gave me was flat because I was running a city street in Chicago. But I'm looking forward to the time where I'll be able to get to some hills again, so I can really put it through some paces and see how it does. The other thing, though, and probably like from the day-to-day perspective, the feature that I'll use the most of all of these things is the fact that there's finally relatively live weather data that I can see as a watch face. And that's something that I look at constantly. I don't need it as much now since I'm not commuting to work anymore, but I used to run commute to and from work. And so I'd always wanted to know what the weather was going to be like in like a couple hours. So like to know like 2 hours from now, is it going to be raining? Is it going to be windy? How do I need to alter my routes? Am I going to be okay to do my run commute home today? That kind of thing. So I'm always looking at the weather, always looking at the hour by hour forecast. And I wasn't able to get that on the Vantage V, not in a way that I could figure out. Now it's available as a watch face, and it's something that I look at all the time. The only thing that's a drawback about it is that it doesn't quite update as frequently as I would like. It seems to be like I have to manually or somewhat manually like sync it with my phone for the fresh weather data to come up. Sometimes I'll look at my watch and it'll tell me when it was last updated, and it's relatively recent. Other times it'll have been like 6 or 7 hours since it last updated, and I'll push an update there. So it's not quite as smoothly integrated as, say, like some of the complications on an Apple Watch, where you can get really great current and upcoming weather data, but it's a step in the right direction and just about the right amount of information that I need, although I wish I could get it updating a little bit more frequently, even if it meant for me a little bit of a battery hit. That's a trade-off that I would gladly take. The other thing that I absolutely love about this watch is that it seems to be a little bit brighter than the Vantage V. I don't know if it's that I'm getting old or what it is, or maybe it's because I'm a little bit colorblind, but I really like for watches to be very bright and very visible. I've reviewed some other brands of watches where the watches were great, but I just couldn't ever get them bright enough, and so I couldn't keep using the watch. The Vantage V, I thought, does a pretty good job of managing like screen brightness and overall battery life. Here in the Grit X, we're getting even brighter screens, so I definitely appreciate that. And because it has a giant battery in it, a battery that can certainly outlast any activity that I might put it through. I'm very happy to see that there is an even brighter brightness setting. So another great feature that probably isn't going to make it into like the spec sheet, but something that's super important to me. So those are my thoughts so far after just a couple of days with the Polar Grit X. Let me know in the comments if you have any more questions. I'd love to talk to you guys about it more down there. And I've been doing daily live streams on YouTube. Actually been doing 2 a day. One in the morning, 6 a.m. Central on Instagram, and then one in the afternoons, 3 p.m. Central on YouTube. So if you have any other questions about it, those live streams are great places to get really quick responses from me. Comments are one thing. I try to respond to them all relatively quickly, but if you really want an answer quick, come to either one of those live streams and check me out there. Definitely happy to talk to you guys more about the Grit X or just anything about running in any of those live streams. So a couple of different ways to get in touch with me and to keep talking and keep the conversation going. That's all I have for today, everybody. Thanks so much for making it all the way to the end of this video, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Yo, what's going on?